Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kristina Sikorajeva, and I'm PSSI Space Securities Program's Project Manager. PSSI's mission is to help safeguard and strengthen the freedoms and democratic institutions of nations in Central and Eastern Europe and beyond. The Institute also seeks to eliminate emerging threats to the Transatlantic Alliance and other partners globally, especially in the economic and financial and outer space domains. The Space Security Guest Lecture Series, which our institute organizes in collaboration with Charles University's Faculty of Social Sciences, constitutes an important outreach activity to raise awareness concerning some of the most pressing space security policy issues. Today, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. John Klein, who is the Senior Fellow and Strategist at the Falcon Research. Dr. John Klein also instructs space policy and strategy courses at George Washington University's Space Policy Institute and is also the author of 3 books on space strategy, deterrence, and the law of armed conflict. And Dr. might tell you more about his background at the beginning of his presentation. So Dr. Klein, thank you very much for being with us today. And before we begin, just a short technical notice. During the lecture, you'll all have the opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A button option that can be found at the bottom of your screens. I will mediate your questions to Dr. Klein after the lecture because I believe we'll have enough Q&A time, so do not hesitate to write down your questions. That is all from my side for now, and Dr. Klein, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you for that kind introduction, and I will bring up my slides at this point. Great. Again, thank you. I'm John Klein, sometimes have a Navy call sign. People call me Patsy. We'll keep this hopefully fast, casual, and informative. Thank you to PSSI for allowing me to speak. It is indeed a great honor. So a little bit about me, prior to becoming an academic, I was in the Navy. Got to fly from aircraft carriers, did that for 22 years, got to see the world and some other not so fun places along the way. I had always wanted to be an astronaut when I was a kid and into my young adult life. And so if you want to be an astronaut when you're in the Navy, you go to the test pilot school. I got a chance to do that, submitted an application to NASA, got picked up to be the Navy's candidate for the astronaut program. And then the Columbia space shuttle mishap happened, where it kind of came apart upon reentry. Everyone put a pause on all astronaut candidate applications at the time. So I was off to plan B of my career. I did a fellowship at Brookings following the Naval War College. I wrote my first manuscript. Fast forward even further. Presently, I work at the Pentagon when I have to go in the office and support the Space Force with space policy and strategy work. For this presentation, the views expressed are mine alone. Anyone who has a chance to teach will say they probably have the best job in the world. I definitely consider myself fortunate and blessed. I teach at the undergraduate level at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. For any instructors out there, there's a wait list. The space is hot. There's a high demand for the topic. I also teach at the graduate level at Georgetown University, alternating semesters with GW. And then occasionally I have a doctoral student or two from a few universities in the Washington, D.C. area. Again, as was mentioned during the kind introduction, I've been writing a while. It's been almost 2 decades, which makes me, as they say, seasoned for space policy and strategy. First article I wrote, I took a maritime strategy approach to thinking about space using the work of Julian Corbett and his principles of some principles of maritime strategy. Turned that into my first book, came out in 2006. As a follow-on, if the first 2 works were Corbett and Orbit, as it's been called, the second book, Understanding Space Strategy, should be called Corbett is Not Enough. You can't take one renowned strategist and make analogies and show the application to space in itself. And then from there, brings us to the topic of today's discussion is irregular warfare in space, a fight for the final frontier. I am, again, I had the privilege of studying under the late Colin Gray while I got my PhD at the University of Reading in England. Was a wonderful experience. Dr. Gray wrote 30 books, hundreds and hundreds of book chapters and other articles too. So he, to this day, influences a lot of my work and much of the discussion that we'll be talking about today. So why irregular warfare? Why this? You may say, hey, Dr. Klein, you can't make up your mind. Is it a maritime analogy? Should we look at Clausewitz, Thucydides, and Sun Tzu? Or is it irregular warfare? Why all this change? And, when I studied, the work of Corbett, Clausewitz, Sun Tzu, Thucydides, something just didn't really feel, and we weren't seeing violence in a classic sense, according to Clausewitz writing. Nobody was dying, but it wasn't peace either. We were seeing nefarious, malicious activities. We have the Russia's direct descent ASAT testing, which caused large amount of debris a few years ago. We have GPS jamming that's going on both sides in Ukraine. We have rendezvous and proximity operations going on. Open source stuff you can read about is some of the satellites of China and Russia. So this wasn't classical armed conflict, but it wasn't really what we would consider the desired peace. So I said, perhaps a better approach, instead of a maritime analogy, maybe we should think of it as a mode of warfare, in this case, the irregular mode. So the first question I usually get, a little bit of terms and reference, what is irregular warfare? So this is the definition that I use. Irregular warfare is apart from major conventional wars against an enemy who takes a similar approach. Irregular warfare doesn't mean it's an irregular occurrence. It happens all the time. And you look at strategic history, and it's been going along for millennia. Now, some of you out there, looks like we have 61 participants. You may be rolling your eyes and like said, oh, good grief, you just defined irregular warfare as the opposite of regular warfare. And that is true, but I'll point out in strategic studies, we do that all the time. We have the direct and indirect approach, and we have symmetrical operations or symmetry, and then asymmetric. So, one term only has meaning with respect to itself. And in this case, irregular warfare only has meaning with respect to regular warfare. It's an old idea. Irregular warfare, we've called it by different names throughout the centuries, and even in more recent decades. We have asymmetric warfare, counterinsurgency, gray zone operations is pretty much in vogue now. It's what we see from a lot of behaviors from China and Russia. It's not what we consider major armed conflict necessarily, but it's coercive and nefarious actions. James Cable wrote about gunboat diplomacy, guerrilla warfare, and you can read the rest here. But it's an old idea, and we can look to historical experience as we consider potential solutions for what we're seeing in the space domain and involving space architectures. So what are some examples after this definition? Again, so this is apart from major force-on-force actions, GPS jamming. It seems going forward, we should expect for a lot of GPS signals to be denied during military operations. We saw cyber attacks against the company Viasat leading up to the invasion of Russia forces into Ukraine. We have the role of commercial companies is playing a larger role. So again, this brings up this idea of proxies and potential proxy war. And then rendezvous and proximity operations. So these would be non-cooperative. So two satellites getting close, potential inspections, coercive actions, and the like. So that begs the question. I've given you an example of irregular warfare in space. What would be some examples of regular warfare? And fortunately for us, this is hopefully will look like the realm of science fiction. So, but some examples again. So, major force-on-force actions. This could be a direct descent, anti-satellite missiles against position, navigation, and timing constellations such as Galileo or the U.S. GPS. We could have space-based weapons such as kinetic kill vehicles going after high-end, exquisite satellites used for Earth observation. We could have space-based lasers that also go after these high-value systems. And then we have somewhat renowned idea of rods from God. These are tungsten rods that would be launched from low Earth orbit, space to Earth type of effects. And these could potentially generate the order of a few thousand kilotons, a few kilotons of TNT. So you may say, "Hey, what are you saying, Dr. Klein? Is this the new thing, or are we supposed to focus on irregular warfare?" Yeah, I like this quote from the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates. He said a few years ago, when thinking about the range of threats, it's common to divide the high end from the low end, the conventional from the irregular, the armored divisions on one side, guerrilla-toting AK-47s on the other. In reality, the categories of warfare are blurry and do not fit into neat, tidy boxes. Well, one of the reasons I really like this quote is he was paraphrasing Colin Gray. But we have to consider a range of potential futures. And I would say what we're seeing in Ukraine kind of underscores that. We need to plan for regular styles of competition and conflict, and then also the irregular style, the high end and the low end. And we need to plan for the same thing in the space domain. The emphasis of the latest book is on irregular warfare because it's really not appreciated or well understood, but hopefully it'll kind of make sense as we progress. So in the United States, the U.S. Space Force, the General Chance Saltzman has talked about this idea of competitive endurance as his part of his theory of success. And I like this terminology, competitive endurance, for two reasons. One, he's talking about competition, not conflict. So I would say that aligns to how we're defining irregular warfare. It's not part of violence or armed conflict, but part of this competitive range. And then also the endurance element too. So this connotes a time element, a protracted strategy. You're not going to achieve success in a short order. So even though I don't use it in the book, I started writing this at the beginning, this latest book at the beginning of the pandemic, but this came out in the last year or so. But it's helpful. And I'd say it's two sides of the same coin. So General Saltzman is talking about how do you outcompete or operate with this competitive endurance framework. My work is on irregular warfare, and I spend the last chapter offering my solutions. So it's both trying to look at the problem from the same way, one providing a solution to the other set. So I use this in my classes and when I write a lot. Space is not special, just wonderfully different. And what I mean by that is, we have millennia of experience with competition and conflict. We can look to historical experience, strategic lessons as we consider the problems we're seeing in space. But the space domain is different than the other domains. There is an overlap with the cyberspace domain, however. We can explore later on in the conversation. So we can look to old ideas when we kind of consider what we want to do as a solution. And speaking of old ideas and the people who wrote them, about them, so we have Sun Tzu here. He wrote over 2,000 years ago in his book, Art of War. And he talks about a variety of things. Most of it has to do with using deception and surprise, asymmetric advantage, achieving the most gain for the least amount of effort, and attacking the enemy where they are unprepared. So that's relevance for the space domain would be potentially direct descent anti-satellite missiles, which can go after exquisite systems. So this is again a relatively low cost capability that could take out a higher value asset. The direct descent anti-satellite missiles are becoming more widespread in use. So also another old idea that we understand is the indirect approach by B.H. Littleheart. He wrote about it in his book Strategy, the Indirect Approach. He wrote, in the context, he disagreed with Clausewitz's idea of total war, even though it was in theory. He saw the carnage of the world wars, and he thought, well, can you achieve political aims outside the direct use of military force? And so he had this idea, well, let's achieve this. It doesn't have to be through the use of militaries or direct competition. Maybe we can use movement and surprise, again, asymmetric attack, the role of proxies. So an example for the space domain of the indirect approach could be the use of commercial companies being used as proxies. And we're to a modern example, Ukraine, we see Starlink being used by Ukrainian forces for command and control purposes. We see other commercial capabilities that states are looking at for innovation and potentially other applications, these dual use applications. So the next is J.C. Wiley. He wrote his book, Military Strategy, A General Theory of Power Control in 1967. So for Wiley, he talks about the cumulative strategy and the sequential strategy. So first, the sequential strategy is pretty well understood. We saw this on the US side in the World War II, the Pacific Campaign, where they had this island hopping strategy. So they had to have success in one area through military force. And then that success led to the possibility of achieving success next. So you need one success to achieve the next. But the other part is the cumulative strategy. And this is the piling up of small, relatively inconsequential actions that in themselves don't really mean much or have much strategic effect, but over time they can pile up and they can achieve strategic effect. So we call this, sometimes it's called salami slicing, death by 1,000 cuts, but it's this idea of using time as a weapon to achieve strategic effect. What are some examples of this for the space domain? I would say establishing norms of behavior. We know that norms of behavior are good to maintain safe and responsible environment for all space actors, but they take decades to actually implement. And you have to have an occurrence and examples of both the behavior you want and then also response to any type of nefarious behaviors that you disagree with. So, and another example would be the case of Lawfare in the space domain, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Probably one of the most renowned strategists on irregular warfare is Mao Zedong. He wrote about in his writings during his conflict with the nationalists under Chiang Kai-shek. This idea, he used both the indirect approach and cumulative strategies to upset the status quo. So he understood his approach had to be, attack, withdraw, keep his forces around to fight another day. Again, it uses a strong element of time, definitely long-term. And he understood the importance of not just military actions, but non-military actions also. So that was maybe more of a history lesson than you were bargaining for. But I want to bring up a conversation that's being debated in the national security space community. And this is the idea of first mover advantage, or alternately second mover disadvantage. So the idea is everything in space is vulnerable. Everyone can see your activities. There's no defense. So, in a potential conflict, the first opponent to move first has an advantage because they can take out the most high value space assets or spacecraft. So if you move second, you would be at a disadvantage. But I want to, whenever the US talks about conflict and this idea of first mover advantage or second mover disadvantage, that comes into the realm of deterrence theory a lot. And I think that would be helpful to discuss. Is there really a second mover disadvantage? Well, the short answer is it depends how you've actually fielded your forces in your space architectures. So this is an example. This is from an old movie, Rocky IV, if you know your Rocky trivia. So this idea of deterrence by punishment, I would say in the US and the West, we generally understand this idea of deterrence by punishment. You read the US national security strategies or defense strategies, and it will basically say, hey, if you mess with us, we will respond in a time, place, and domain of our choosing. So implicit in that is this idea that we will respond with military force if you attack us. So inherent right of self-defense. This is generally understood, but there's this other side of deterrence. So this has to do with cost imposition, but the next has to do with denial of benefit or the defense. So as opposed to the two boxers in the fighting ring, we have from a US carnival or fair, we have two people in padded suits. So they're both well protected. They're probably on a hot summer day here in the States. They're probably they're sweating a lot and getting very fatigued. So after about 5 minutes of trying to push each other out of the ring here, they may give up and go decide to have a nice Pilsner beer or something like that. So in this case, instead of imposing cost and hurting the opponent, the two opponents kind of give up. They convey the futility of any action. No matter what you do, your actions are going to be inconsequential. You can't hurt me. And this is a powerful area. In the space community, we know this, but we call it a different name. It's a space mission assurance and resilience. So this idea, if you read this, I have a picture of this white paper from 2015. It's what I refer to a lot in my writings, but it talks about what resilience is. It's different orbitologies, proliferated LEO, it's non-space solutions to your capabilities and services. It's incorporated allies and partners, deception, potentially also. So it's having so much capability, different orbits, different type of diversified capabilities that if you shoot down one satellite, I have 9,999 other capabilities. So it conveys the futility of action. We can go into it over the Q&A, but if you look at the deterrence approaches of the United States and the West, the different approaches or mindsets of China and Russia, I do believe deterrence by denial of benefit should have a significant role into deterrence strategies, given the differences in cost imposition and what is considered an actual cost by the three. One thing I write about in the book, and I was fortunate to have Charlie Dunlap, who coined the word lawfare, to kind of review the chapter. But what we see from China and Russia is an intentional distortion of legal regimes. So this idea goes back to the idea of B.H. Littlehart, the indirect approach. Can I achieve political objectives outside the use of military force? So for China in the South China Sea, declaring, trying to extend territories, building artificial features, impinging the fishing rights of Filipino fishermen, using obfuscation and delay by lawsuits and the court system. So this is something we see terrestrially, and I think we can probably say we see this in the space domain. Both China and Russia have put forth a draft treaty in the past about prohibiting space weapons, which in itself sounds like a great arms control measure, but some of the initiatives were disingenuous because it didn't include the direct ascent ASAT capabilities, which they had also. So our U.S. Department of State came back and highlighted that, but occasionally you'll hear the Chinese and Russian delegations bring up this idea about banning space-based weapons. One thing that was a pleasant surprise from my writings, I was surprised that the U.S. Special Operations Forces had their own initiative, and they were very much intrigued by some of the writings. And the biggest question that they have is, they want to know, how can space support the Special Operations Forces acting terrestrially? And it's kind of in the classical sense. So this I pulled from a Space Force doctrine publication, but what you see in blue are the areas of space capabilities and services that traditionally have supported terrestrial military operations. So we have position, navigation, and timing, whether it's GPS, Galileo, GLONASS, or BeiDou. We have satellite communications, like we saw see being used in Ukraine as if it's commercially. We have intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Again, we saw that from Maxar's commercial capabilities of all the Russian tanks lined up in a row entering Ukraine. Environmental monitoring is one of those things that folks forget about. It has to do with weather forecasting. There are a few weather satellites out there, and having an accurate 5-day forecast is very important for land operations. And the last one in blue at the bottom is space access, mobility, and logistics. Part of that is the launch capabilities, whether it's SpaceX getting a national security payload up there, launching military or intelligence satellites into space. So this is my last full slide here. I write books, I teach classes, even though my day job, I support the Space Force. But as an academic, your writing shouldn't be an academic exercise in the end. It should actually be able to help solve real problems. So I tried to spend some time, given our understanding of irregular warfare, and actually suitable approaches to counter those strategies. So chapter 8 lists 10 recommendations on how to outcompete US or Western rivals that use irregular methods. And I just want to highlight this in the blue shading box. These are non-material solutions. So for the US, they don't have to necessarily build a new satellite. It doesn't involve shiny equipment or very expensive spacecraft and architectures. A lot of these, most of the recommendations are non-material. So it has to do with training and education, maintaining political and domestic support for this protracted type of competition. Prepare for competition. I will say sometimes the U.S. is criticized for not being able to stay the course on these multi-decade endeavors. But for competition against rivals, that is definitely needed. Something I talk about also is the need for intra-war deterrence strategies. So we have this phrase that shows up in U.S. strategies a lot, is if deterrence fails, we will respond in time, place, and domain of our choosing. Deterrence is about affecting the decision calculus of rivals or opponents, and it's their worldview that matters most. But we can't give up on affecting the decision calculus, providing off-ramps, opportunities to de-escalate a conflict, even when conflict happens. So you need to have approaches on how you can actually get back to pre-conflict status quo. For the West, it has, besides the military capability, it has two great strategic advantages. That's its breadth of allies and partners. China and Russia don't really have the same level, except maybe if they're coerced to some extent. So the U.S. appreciates that. I know sometimes working with the U.S. can be kind of frustrating for allies, especially when it comes to higher classifications and sometimes the opaque type of conversation. And the other part is the commercial innovation. The United States is fortunate to have a lot of good companies that do have technological capabilities and seek to innovate. And we have to pursue non-military solutions and be flexible and adaptable. So I see I've gone about 30 minutes. Now we can go into the Q&A or just kind of talk about anything that you want. Chances are I have heard every question from my students or somewhere other for us, so I will open the floor from there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Klein, for the lecture that touched upon many interesting and important space and irregular warfare related issues. In the meantime, some intriguing questions popped up in the chat. So our audience would like to know what your predictions or thoughts are on GNSS denial and or spoofing going forward. And a sub-question is whether civilian and military infrastructure is ready for this in a hybrid conflict scenario.
Great. Two very important questions. So the first on denying GNSS, I think we should expect GPS, GNSS, PNT jamming in most all conflicts going forward. It's relatively inexpensive to do. It just has to do with, the signal to power ratio. So you can have localized effect. These satellites are often medium Earth orbit, so they're pretty far. You're not going to deny all the coverage throughout the world at the same time, but you can have localized effect. And I think militaries are coming to grips with that. But militaries also train to operate in denied GNSS environments too. So it may just slow things down. It's not going to prevent conflict or from mission success eventually. There's other ways, and we've been doing that for decades or centuries beforehand. We just have to go back to some of those. The idea of the intermingling of government and commercial capabilities into hybrid architectures, that's an area that is being explored more. On the legal side, we have Dr. Koplow from Georgetown University of Law that wrote about some of the potential problems with intermingling into hybrid architectures. We're not able to provide an opponent to discriminate between the military and the non-military objective per the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. We're trying to minimize the cost and suffering of civilians or non-military entities. And if you have a hybrid architecture, you could potentially make that harder. So the U.S. has embraced the idea of hybrid architectures, and I think in European countries, there's this idea of public-private partnerships between governments and commercial that's generally accepted. So if we've said we're going to operate side by side with commercial partners, how does that extend into conflicts? From the U.S. perspective, we know Putin has said that Starlink is an extension of the United States. And implicit in that is that Russia sees no problem going after commercial capabilities if they're providing services in military operations. That might not be an original insight, but for the United States and Western liberal democracies, I'll flip that question. How do we feel about going after the commercial capabilities provided to rivals in times of conflict? So are we okay with going after them, even if there could be a civilian impact? How about third-party commercials? Say if there was a conflict between the great powers, but what if India was providing commercial capabilities? Would those capabilities be okay to go try to deny or degrade? We shouldn't be surprised by this question, but I would say for the U.S. and its allies, we need to ask these hard questions now. What do you feel comfortable with in a political context? It might depend on the type of conflict that's going on, kind of like we saw states withdrawing commercial or companies in Moscow following its invasion of Ukraine. But let's have those hard discussions now. instead of just trying to pretend that they don't exist.
Thank you very much. We have many more, so let's just jump straight to the next one. So how do you judge the cooperation between the US government, its allies, and commercial providers? You kind of digged into it a little, so maybe can you dive deeper into this bit more?
All right, so from a US approach, it's going to bring its capabilities, but space, it's big, right? It's an international environment, a domain. The United States has to work with its allies and partners and commercial companies, one, to set future norms of behavior. It's going to take, what is safe and responsible. It needs to be set by countries and states, and we're seeing this through the long-term sustainability guidelines at the United Nations. That U.S. Department of Defense came out with tenets of responsible behavior, no creation of long-lived debris. But the allies are also coming around. We have more signatories for the voluntary ban of direct ascent ASAT testing. Again, I'll emphasize this is testing. It doesn't actually make the world a safer place from the use of them, but it does. We were not going to be creating more debris through the testing of these direct ascent ASAT capabilities. The commercial we see with companies like SpaceX, OneWeb, all these Earth observation capabilities, international launch providers, Ariane and the like. We've been operating in the space domain for decades. So we have norms of behavior to a certain extent already. We just don't have all the norms of behavior. So how close is too close? We know we shouldn't interfere with, do purposeful radio frequency interference, and the International Telecommunications Union and the like understand that. But how close is too close? And I think we need to discuss proliferated LEO or low Earth orbit, how orbits are being assigned. Right now, it's at the country level. What happens when there's competing claims over the same altitude block? Right now, you have countries, I think India a few years ago put forth a license for 30,000 satellites. So if we're having competing claims in the same, and we have conjunctions or collisions, as we say in space, we could cause more debris. We have humans living in space on space stations, and there's going to be commercial space stations too. So low Earth orbit is an important one. Unlike we know we can trash or cause lots of amount of trash in the seas and in our landfills. Let's not cause a lot of debris in space. And the U.S. working with its allies, partners, and commercial needs to kind of shape the environment and have a clear picture. We can talk more about it, but the Artemis Accords is also part of that vision as we go back to the moon and start exploring. And now there's a interest in water ice on the lunar South Pole. That will take cooperation at the international level too.
Thank you very much. Another question from the Hector Falcon from Space Isaac is he would like to know, with the amount of dual use functionalities making their way onto the satellite domain, how can we as users help secure this domain? This is a very good question.
Well, I'm going to rephrase that question, given Space Isaac is part of it. Something I'm exploring. I have a bad habit. I like to write books. So the latest one, the space and cyber domains are intertwined. So what does that mean in a strategic sense? And I think the war in Ukraine is kind of highlighting that. So again, back to the example, we saw prior to Russia's invasion, it conducted a cyber attack against a commercial company that was providing capabilities. So in this case, Viasat, a communications company, and it's looking into denying the space. Starlink was also had some attacks. So I think fundamentally, what do people need to consider? We need to understand this interconnectedness. Cyber warfare and space warfare may be one and the same, may go back and forth. A cyber conflict may turn into a space warfare conflict and vice versa. There is still some interconnectedness with the other domains and the like, but another problem with norms, satellites under constant jamming and lasing on a daily basis. This has been going on for years and years. And I would say the cyber domain has also been under cyber attack and that's considered part of the natural day-to-day activities. But the cyber community has, a few years back, has figured out it can't just sit back and take it. It needs to take measures to respond. I would say for the space community needs to take on a similar approach. Jamming and lasing of someone else's satellite is not okay. But what are the consequences? It doesn't have to be a military effect. Maybe it's a lawsuit going through the International Criminal Court or some other type of trade or economic type of embargo levied against those who are doing malicious activities in space. So hopefully that helped a little bit, but we need to apply the lessons that we've learned terrestrially to the space domain, and we have lots of lessons to pull from.
Thank you. I just got immersed in more questions.
That's okay. That's a good sign.
Yeah, it's a very good sign. So the next question would be, I just noticed this one, how to format the Space Force so that it becomes both a regular and irregular warfare fighting force in space, from space, and for space.
Wow. Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
That is the main question. It's I kind of hinted it. So it's training and education. It's putting forth doctrine that explains. A criticism of the United States, again, is that it has a short memory. In that fact, like we learn lessons and then we forget those lessons. So right now, we relearned a lot of our irregular warfare strategies during Iraq and Afghanistan. Those lessons are starting to be forgotten. As we go back off, if you listen to some of the press statements, we're back in an era of great power competition. And I'm okay with competition because it's below the threshold of armed conflict, which again is part of the irregular warfare framework. But let's not forget the irregular warfare elements. Proxies and proxy war are going to be fundamental. I do spend a chapter talking about the role of commercial companies in a legal sense and an illegal sense. The idea of force for hire is an idea that goes back millennia. We saw this back in ancient times where if you didn't have a military fighting force, but you had the treasure or the economic means, you could procure a force. Sometimes we call them the M word, which is mercenaries. The euphemism in the West for mercenaries is private military companies. And that is a big business that is not talked about much. But three services that private military companies provide are training and education, logistical support, and security. We're starting to see logistical support in the space domain through refueling and other on-orbit servicing. So are we starting to see the potential for private military companies, private entities that are providing security or force in the space domain? I would say money always finds a way, maybe being a cynic, but if there's a need, I think it will be filled. Let's figure out what that means on the US and Western approaches through frank discussions with our allies and the like. But so maybe a long-winded question to a very short answer to a short question. But it goes back to, if you want a new idea, read an old book. For the Space Force folks, let's pick up the old books and let's understand what competition and conflict has meant through the ages and how space fits into that.
Thank you very much. And what would you say is the most crucial next step or the biggest gap in the US, European, and or allied space security policies and governance regarding the monitoring of these irregular threats?
Have to pick one. You got me on the spot.
Yeah, I'm looking for less complex ones, but it gets
okay. I think, and this kind of goes back to what I said, I don't think we have a full handle on what it means to have hybrid architectures and working with commercial. I know it sounds good, using commercial for innovation and commercial capabilities, but how is it going to affect the character of how we fight conflicts in the future? Are all commercial companies going to be fair game? To extrapolate, and if you buy into that, okay, if a commercial company is providing services and they're obviously part of the fighting force and they can be targeted, how about commercial headquarters? Is SpaceX headquarters a legitimate military target? Okay, if it's providing military capabilities. I'm sure there's some lawyers or counsels out there that would debate that one. We could go to the law of armed conflict and the principle of distinction and necessity and targeting. But these are important questions, but it's also on our side. Are we going to go after that, and to what extent? Um, it's a hard one because it may be political driven. Clausewitz teaches that war is an extension of policy by other means. So policy and politics will play into these decisions, and that's to be expected, but let's at least have the discussion. But if I had to pick one area that needs more exploration, I'd pick that. And I'll also segue into going back to the moon. NASA's contracting with commercial providers to extract water ice. We have, the Artemis Accords calls for safety zones. Again, back to how close is too close. I'm an old Navy guy. I like the Incidents at Sea agreement where we said it was safe and professional behavior, and we didn't give a limit on how close ships could get or aircraft could get. But I think as states go back and we use commercial, how are we going to compete over the same water ice resources going back to the moon?
Thank you very much for an extensive answer to that. So several senior NATO officials have indicated that China is acquiring space capabilities that will soon make it dominant in this domain. And well, the question is, what is your prediction for the development of the militarization of space?
Wonderful question. And so you said the militarization, so we'll do a quick little distinction. I know the person asking the question understands the difference. So space has been militarized since the beginning. We've used space for military command and control. Space launch vehicles launch military payloads or intelligence collection satellites. So space is militarized. That's nothing new. What we're talking about is the weaponization. That's the concern. So a space weapon isn't generally defined. If something's traveling as fast as a bullet in low Earth orbit, technically anything could be a weapon. But some of the Chinese capabilities have raised some eyebrows. Open source stuff, if you look at SJ-21's maneuver capability, that is significant. I personally don't believe, China is portrayed as the pacing threat, according to U.S. national leaders. I don't think they're in a position to overtake or have a superior presence in the space domain or through military capabilities. But it's definitely concerning, and folks are looking at it seriously. I think the U.S. and the West in general doesn't want to see space weaponized in a classical sense. So, what does arms control measures look like for the space domain? How do you have monitoring, verification, and compliance? We understood that you could go terrestrially and do inspections of potential nuclear weapon sites or launch facilities during the Cold War, but how do you do inspections on space assets? Is it proximity operations? What does that look like? Is arms control even viable in the space domain? Those are topics of great passion on both sides, from both arms control advocates and more folks who come across as being hawkish. But I'd say, again, going back to the lessons of history, arms control has helped in some cases when it comes to proliferation of chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons. And maybe there's promise for arms control in the space domain too.
Thank you very much. And well, in the evolving landscape of space infrastructure, where the demarcation lines between civilian and military assets becomes very blurred, what strategies do you foresee being implemented to safeguard civilian space infrastructure during potential future conflicts? And alternatively, do you anticipate that civilian space infrastructure will face significant vulnerabilities in such scenarios?
That's a hard one, as there's a lot there. So I'll say what goes back to how do you protect civilian or commercial or architectures or things that have dual use even. I'd say it goes back to this deterrence by denial of benefit. If you can convey to PRC leadership or Putin, I have so much stuff. I have thousands and thousands of satellites. I have commercial, I have military. You can take out a commercial satellite, you can take out a military satellite. It is not going to matter. But this depends on the US and the West declassifying and being more forthright in its capabilities in the space domain. Historically, the US is overclassified and doesn't do a very good job of sharing that information. You can't deter others from action or dissuade them if they don't know about their capabilities. But I do think on the commercial side, whenever I bring up this idea of commercial Earth observation or intelligence and surveillance and reconnaissance being part of the kill chain, are they okay with that? So I get a lot of this teeth sucking by the commercial companies. Well, we don't want to be considered part of the kill chain. But if you're providing Earth observation data that can be used for targeting, satellite communications that are part of the military command and control to use weapons, you are part of the kill chain. I think SpaceX is going through some of their ethical questioning, maybe through their ethics officer. How much should a commercial company be involved in conflict? How much capabilities? So, SpaceX is, I think they are suggesting a space shield as the defense element and keeping the Starlink as the commercial. But I think commercial companies need to have an internal discussion, an ethics conversation. What do we feel comfortable with? Maybe the boards of directors will have different comfort levels depending on the kind of competition or conflict we're talking about. But that subject is ripe for discussion.
So thank you very much. So you've kind of mentioned this, but Matusz Babiak would like to know whether you think that Starlink's space infrastructure could be classified as a legitimate military target by the Russian government. And that's a rather theoretical one, but what would the reaction of the White House be in case of a Russian attack on a Starlink space infrastructure by anti-satellite rockets?
So the first one is relatively easy. And this goes back to lawfare. So China and Russia use lawfare, the intentional distortion of legal regimes or what we consider norms. Putin calling Starlink a legitimate military target would be a political decision. He will make that regardless of what the law of armed conflict says. We could have if he believes attacking Starlink is something he wants to do, he's going to do it, and he's going to say whatever you want, saying, hey, the US, you didn't separate your architectures and you left me no choice. It doesn't matter what the narrative is. And we should expect all rivals to the West to do something similar. So I think that's part. And what was the second part of that question? It escapes me.
The second part was about the White House reaction in case the Russian anti-satellite rockets would attack some Starlink infrastructure.
Well, I do not know that one, but let's go down through some potential futures. So how did they attack it? Did they take out the entire constellation? If you take out 10,000 satellites, right, that must have been some big event. Maybe it was a very large event that created lots of debris and wiped out a whole orbital regime. That would pose potential threat to human life. So that would probably warrant a political decision and maybe a more stringent or imposing response. But to the other side is if they just took out one, say they launched a direct descent or used a laser against a satellite, and only took out one, maybe that doesn't require as such a earnest response. So it depends on how it was attacked. We'll go from one extreme of just one satellite, but if it was an entire constellation, chances are it didn't just take out Starlink, it took out a whole bunch of other things that impacted human life. So that may be a different response, but it's yeah, that would be hopefully we don't find ourselves there.
Hopefully. And since we're running out of time, there's a shorter question. How effectively is the United States equipped to implement deterrence strategies based on the concept of denial of benefit?
It's really well, because we have space mission insurance. We've been talking about it for years. It's gaining traction. We have to fund it. So we have to have proliferated architectures, constellations, multiple orbitologies, but yeah, I separate deterrence by denial of benefit from punishment, but they are kind of intertwined. They're doing better. There's still more work to do on understanding how resilience affects deterrence by denial of benefit. But I'll go back to, you got to let your rivals know your capabilities. Otherwise, deterrence by denial of benefit does not work.
Thank you very much. And the very last short one would be that many non-state actors are gaining access to space. And how do you think this will change the counterinsurgency?
I do highlight that and talk about the role of, we'll call them terrorists or the undeterrable. There are some actors that don't care about taking away space for everybody. If they have very little capabilities and they have nothing to lose, they may go after ground segments, ground terminals through terrorist activities, or do more harmful activities that take space away from everybody, maybe large debris generating events or the like. I think that's not well understood. I always tell, you can't predict the future. You have to plan for the range of potential futures. So you do have to take into account what happens if terrorists act, non-state actors, they will call them commercial companies. What if commercial companies are acting in a military manner because they're a force for hire? But it's not well understood, but it's something we need to plan for.
Since the time is up, let me once again thank you, Dr. Klein, for your insights and very extensive answers and into space and irregular warfare, and for being with us today. We definitely look forward to hosting you anytime in the future. And I also want to thank the rest of you for attending today's guest lecture, and I hope to see you during any of PSSI next space security events. And I wish all of you a very nice day. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.